All right, we are back in the Fireside PM podcast, and I've got Bob Pratt, who is a SVP of Product at MixMode, on the show. We're going to spend most of the time doing a little bit of a trip down memory lane and sharing kind of hard lessons learned over our respective PM careers. But before we do that, welcome to the show, Bob, and why don't you just introduce yourself?
Thanks, Tom. Yeah, nice to meet everybody, virtually at least. Yeah, my name's Bob Pratt. As Tom said, I run product for MixMode. We're a startup basically applying a variant of AI technology, but not large language learning models, to
Oh,
analyze. I know everybody asks that. Uh, Basically, though, we analyze security event data in high volumes and detect threats that are missed by the human analysts, not because they're not good at their job or anything, but just because there's never enough hours in the day and you never have enough security people to look at all the data that you want to look at in every possible way. Just too many needles and too many haystacks. So we're trying to solve that. I've been doing product management for, I hate to admit it, but over 30 years at this point, and working in internet security and network management almost as long. As it turns out, specializing in this whole internet TCP/IP networking stack and what you can do with it back in the 80s was a good career decision. I think the
clearly.
internet's going to take off. I think it'll succeed.
It's the next big thing. So what MixMode does, do you use like machine learning? Is that
Yeah,
yeah, got it.
a variety of it, called dynamical systems, which, despite sounding like a typo, is a field of math that's specifically created for analyzing extremely large data flows. Like, it's typically used in physics and mechanical engineering for modeling very large finite systems. But it turns out you can apply the same mathematics to analyzing security event data and looking for the unusual and therefore the bad behaviors.
I love it. It seems like there's always going to be bad people trying to do bad things. So you probably will have a lot of demand, and you're probably seeing a lot of demand for the offering. So
Yeah, one
congrats.
thing I've always liked about working in security in general, and I've been doing it, like I said, for security specific products for almost 20 years at this point, is unlike a lot of other areas of technology where you're trying to do something faster, cheaper, easier than before. Security is an area where it's almost gamified in that there's bad guys that you're trying to outsmart on the other side. And that keeps it interesting for me. Honestly, if I were just trying to do the 13th version of a database that was 10% faster than the previous version, I probably wouldn't really be that excited about it. I'm like, okay, who cares? But in security, you've always got to think of what's the next thing the bad guys are going to do, and you have to try and outsmart them. And to me, that keeps security really entertaining.
Yeah, that reminds me of when I worked at YouTube. I was always surprised by how creative bad actors can be when they have a financial incentive to do so. And you'd
Oh yeah,
always be like, oh my God, like, where did they come up with that approach? And, you try and harden it and tamp it down, and then they come up with something else, and we would do it
yeah.
again.
I mean, I helped a customer. If you don't mind an anecdote, I helped a customer a few years ago. This was at a different company. I was at a different company, a bank in the United Kingdom, where they had a large number of people whose checking accounts were basically getting emptied by hackers, and they couldn't figure out how because they had the right credentials and everything. And it was mostly senior citizens that were being victimized, which was kind of an interesting bit of unusualness as well. Turns out what was happening was the bad guys were just randomly calling people in the UK, just randomly dialing phone numbers. And this was a bank where about a third of the population uses this bank. So if you call up just a random phone number and say, "Are you a customer of Bank XYZ?" you're going to get a hit a pretty high percentage of the time. And they were telling people, "Okay, this is the security department of XYZ Bank. Your account's been hacked. You need to reset your passwords and credentials." And then they would do something very clever. They would tell the prospective victim, go get your wallet and get out your ATM card. And on the back of it, you'll see an 0800 number, which is the UK equivalent of an 800, toll-free number. And they'd say, to be safe, because I just called you, you don't know that I'm from the bank. I'm going to hang up and I want you to call the number on the back of your card. And then the security department will walk you through your resetting everything. And then the bad guy would simulate a click and a dial tone. Because if you're on a landline and you hear a dial tone, a lot of
Yeah.
people start dialing. And of course, then the victim thinks they've actually called the bank themselves and happily hands over mother's maiden name and where they went to college and their first, every security thing you could possibly want as a bad guy. They just volunteer all of it. And that's why it
That
was
is so
mostly senior
clever.
citizens. Because if you're on a
Yeah.
mobile, that doesn't work because you see that, oh, they haven't hung up. I'll hit hung up to dial. But on a landline, it worked a lot of the time. Now, yeah, so there's a lot of
Yeah.
nasty, clever people out there.
Yeah. My kids were wanting to watch this movie, The Beekeeper. Have you heard of that movie?
I haven't seen it yet, but it's a new Jason
Okay.
Statham one, I think, right?
Yeah, and I think he delivers some retribution to some of these scam artists.
That's nice to see.
Yeah, he's well cast for the role. Well, Bob, let's go back in time,
Mhm.
and maybe we could think about 2 or 3 things. And you could go first. If you could go back in time and give young Bob Pratt some advice about being, successful and impactful in product management, what would be one of the things that you would share, and why is that such an important lesson in hindsight?
Um, I'll start with a positive one because I have both some positive ones and some lessons I learned the hard way. But starting with a positive one, I think what I would emphasize is the most important thing is to work on a product where you actually have a passion and a vision for what that product should look like. In other words, I think where I've been successful as a product manager in the past and where I've failed or where I've seen other people fail is if you're working on something where it's just a job and you don't really care about the future of the product. If you don't think of it as, this is where my passion is. I want this to be the best XYZ that it can be, whatever that is, then you're not going to do a great job of it as a product manager because as the PM, you're really the glue for the rest of the organization. To the engineers, you represent the voice of the customer. To the sales team, you represent the last word on the technology and can the product do this and how are we better than a competitor? So they all have to believe that you really are like the champion of the product. And if you don't believe it, they're not going to believe it either. So I think it's, make sure you work on a product that you actually care about, that you've got passion for.
Yeah, I totally agree. I mean, when I think back on the products that I've worked on, I think I did the best job on the ones where I gave a hoot, even if I weren't working at the company, about that product. And you just kind of give it a lot more of that love and passion as someone who really authentically cares versus kind of going through the motions and doing best practices and things like that. Now, I will say that if you're earlier in your career, you may not have as many options. And, then you are going to have to work on that, whatever insurance product or something,
Yeah,
something that you might not be
absolutely.
passionate about. But luckily, like as you get further on in your career, you have a lot more agency. And, at some point you just work on stuff that you think is cool. And that's Nirvana.
Yeah, and you also, I think, sometimes learn as you get more knowledgeable about a field, you can become more interested in it. And sometimes it does mean that, yeah, even as you get more senior, there's areas that you're not going to end up working in. Like I really care about mobile app design, but I'm never going to be a head of product for a mobile app company because I don't know anything about writing mobile apps. I'm just a user. I care about it a lot because I use my phone probably more than I should, but it doesn't mean that I'm an expert on it. So yeah, it's finding that balance that I think is important.
Yeah. Okay. I'll share one, which is if I could go back in time, I think one piece of advice I'd give to myself is be careful about how your creativity can be an asset, but it can also be a liability. And specifically, I think a lot of product managers who are ideas guys and gals, they tend to get really excited about, oh, I'm going to connect these dots or I'm going to do this approach. And it is new and novel. but they forget that ultimately we're here to solve customer problems. And maybe it's solving a sort of problem, but not really a big problem. And then you end up kind of building features like in search of problems versus starting, classic advice with the customer and really trying to solve a aspirin problem for them versus like a vitamin problem for them.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think the other sort of aspect of that same thing that you just said is understanding the difference between understanding the customer and being the customer. Because in except for certain corner cases, you're not going to be, as a product manager, you're not going to be representative of the typical customer. You're probably going to have a lot more knowledge and be a lot more technical than the average customer. Again, not in every case, but in general, you're building a product for people who aren't as expert in the field as you are. And so you have to understand them and how they're different from you. Because the way I always put it to engineering teams is if you build a product that only somebody with a master's in computer science from MIT can use, if you that's who your target customer is, that's who's going to buy it. And there aren't that many people with that kind of education.
Totally. What's your next piece of advice?
I think one that I did learn the hard way, and I've learned it a few times the hard way, but eventually it'll stick, is the importance of understanding the difference between necessary and sufficient, especially and most importantly, when you're getting feedback from your sales team, whether that's, direct sales reps for an enterprise product, or it's through channel, or however you're selling the product, you're getting feedback from the people selling it or the system selling it. And it's not at all uncommon that the feedback you'll get will be, we have to have this product to win, we have to have this feature added to win the deal. And, if it's an enterprise sale, for example, and it's a big enough deal, it's okay, then we'll build this feature so you can win the deal. And this isn't a knock on sales reps, because it's kind of their job to present it that way. But a lot of times they'll tell you that they have to have a feature. And what they really mean is, we have to have that feature to get to the next hurdle. Building that feature doesn't guarantee that they'll close the deal. It's just they can guarantee that if you don't build the feature, they won't be able to close the deal. And the problem is you end up going down a slippery slope of getting to the next hurdle and the next hurdle, and building, by the time you get to the end, you may have built 10 custom features for one deal, and then they still don't buy it because maybe they end up running out of money. Something can go wrong. So when a sales rep is, or some other form of customer feedback is saying we have to have this feature to win deals, make sure you understand, is that just saying it's necessary, or is that saying that it's sufficient? In other words, if I build that feature, you will close the deal. You don't need anything else. And that's, like I said, that's one I've learned the hard way a few times, where I've built kind of custom features for particular deals or particular markets. And then it turns out that even after I built that, I get to some other hurdle that I stumble over and can't close deals.
That is such a great area for product kind of judgment, because on the one hand, you want to be have open ears and kind of listen to feedback you're getting from the market or from the sales team. And on the other hand, we've all been there where salesperson says, look, you just need to do this one thing. I'm going to land this huge deal. And to your point, either A, well, that was one of the things, and then they're going to have 5 more things they need after that. Or B, you build it, they get the deal, and then it's not even used. Like it wasn't really as crucial as you originally thought. So yeah, definitely have been there. And the difference between, sometimes it might be necessary, and then there might be 10 other necessaries behind it. And so if you're not prepared to do all 10, then you may not want to do the one. And then sometimes it's like kind of faux necessary, where it's like,
yeah,
we sure
the faux
really
necessary, honestly, I guess I've gotten cynical enough over the years that faux necessary bothers me less. Like if I build the feature and the customer buys the product and they never use the feature, I'm only a little annoyed, because at least I got their money. That's the important thing. I definitely had that. Years and years ago when I worked at Novell, we released a product for what was called the OSI network stack, which only us old people even remember. This was a TCP/IP competitor pushed by the government. And so we released support for it in NetWare, which was the big file server of the day. Found out a couple years later, after a couple thousand customers had bought it, mostly government, they had to buy it with this feature, this option included, or else they couldn't buy our product. So we built the feature. Lots of government customers bought it. We found out a couple years later it didn't actually work because it turned out there was a bug in the installer. And so we know that no one ever installed it because the installer literally didn't work, but no one had ever complained either because they had to have it. As you said, it was faux necessary. They had to have it. They just didn't actually have to use it.
Good stuff.
So we just felt mildly annoyed, but they did buy it. So it worked out.
They did buy it. So you did land the deal.
Exactly.
You know, one of the things you said reminds me of my next tip I would give myself, which is that you and your product are not nearly as big of a deal in your customers' eyes as you think it is. You know, I think as PMs, we spend all day thinking about our product, our roadmap, our backlog, our bugs. And in reality, in most cases, your users, this is like one of 100 things they're doing that day. And I remember when years ago, I was at Microsoft and we worked on this initiative that ended up being launched as Windows Live. And it was like services connected to the Windows operating system. And we thought, I mean, we spent years on it. It was all code names and, oh, I don't know if I can talk to you about this project or whatever. And then I left Microsoft before it launched. And then later on, I caught up with some colleagues and they were like, oh, you know, today was a big day that we launched Windows Live. And I was like, guys, no one's talking about this. Like, this is not as huge of a deal as you think it is. And I think part of that is because we were so fixated on, hey, what is the, you know, kind of in today's parlance, like cloud connected OS strategy. You know, that was very important to Microsoft for obvious reasons, but it wasn't necessarily as top of mind in the user's kind of life as maybe we assumed it would be. And so I think I've also seen this on other projects where, you know, you work on something and you think your product is where they're going to live all day long in, and then you go visit them on site and you're like, oh, they only touched our product like 3 minutes out of their day. So that would be one tip I would give. Like, you know, get over yourself. Your product's great, but it is one of a million things that your users are dealing with right now.
Yeah, definitely. And I think that ties into the you remember that as you're building your user interface as well, that it may be perfectly clear to you because you spend 8 hours a day in it, but you need to train it for the customer who's going to be there for 5 minutes every third day, maybe, and it has to be easy to use. I don't know about you. I feel like that whenever I'm using like HR systems, you know, where I go in once every few months because I have to, like I just did it because I had to download all my tax forms. And I was like, this is a huge pain in the butt. But my HR person loves it because they spend multiple hours every day in the system. And so for them, it's completely intuitive. Whereas for me, the manager who comes in once on rare occasions, I'm like, yeah, this is really just irritating. And I think it's knowing who you're targeting and how often they're going to be in it makes a big difference. Because you're absolutely right. Most of the products we build most of the time are going to be one of a million. That, you know, the number of people who get to be in charge of something like the Google homepage where everybody looks at it all the time, that's a small number of people who have the privilege of doing something like that.
Yeah. And even on that, the user doesn't want to linger on it for that long. They just want to get their job done and move on.
Yeah.
So that's that's my second piece of advice. What's your next one, Bob?
I guess another one would be I learned the hard way, the importance of not relying on a single data point or a single customer making a decision. I learned this the hard way on the very first product I was in charge of was a product called Lanalyzer, which was really the first network analyzer back when the idea of capturing and decoding packets off of a wire was new and innovative. And let's put it this way, this was long enough ago that Ethernet was one of the 3 physical networks that we supported, along with Token Ring and this thing called ArcNet. Those latter two have mostly died horrible deaths, which is a good thing. But anyway, one of the things we did was decode network traffic of different types. And one of the types was IBM SNA traffic, which was an IBM networking protocol. And again, for people who aren't old, which is almost this entire audience, IBM had their own networking protocol instead of TCP/IP. And to make things even more challenging, they used their own character encoding. So they didn't use ASCII. They used something called EBCDIC, which was an equivalent to ASCII, but different. So, hex 32 wasn't space. Hex 32 was, I don't know, the letter Z instead or something. It was just different for no good reason other than they were IBM. But my product captured and decoded all these packets, and we decoded everything in ASCII because that's how we thought the world should work. And I talked to a customer who yelled and screamed at me that I was an idiot and why wasn't I decoding the IBM traffic in EBCDIC because that was IBM standard and I should change it, and what kind of an idiot does this? And I didn't know any better, so I said, sure, made the change, and found out with the next release about the 100 other customers who thought I'd been doing it the right way all along. And so, it's important to not just talk to one customer or one sales rep or one of anything before you make any kind of a major decision. Try and make sure you're getting a broad sample as much as possible. Or if you can only talk to one person about it for whatever reason, at least make sure you consciously know that you're taking a risk there because you've only gotten one data point, and that could be somebody who's different from everyone else out there.
Yeah, I'm a big believer in people getting out of the building, as we used to say, and talking to customers. I will also say that while talking to one customer is probably better than not talking to any customers, there are definitely potential biases and risks with that, and maybe try and talk to 3 to 6 at a time versus just one a year. I remember there were times where I was working on an effort, and we had some engineers join us, like on some ethnographic research. And unfortunately, they didn't have enough time to do like a whole bunch of observations. And the one that they went to was a very opinionated person and had a very unique point of view. And it took like a year and a half to kind of talk down some of the engineers because they were like, but remember, Bob said this. And I'm like, oh, Bob is totally like one person. And, we don't have a million Bobs. Bob, we actually have a whole other segments of users. I still think it's better for people to talk to customers, even if it's fewer. But yeah, I totally agree. Like if you pick the wrong one, or you pick one that just represents a different segment, you can, have that voice in your head every time you're designing the next feature, and it's actually maybe not representative.
Yeah, and I'm in the same boat. I always get very nervous about having my engineers talk to a customer because on the one hand, I want them to talk to customers.
Yeah.
I want them to understand how people are using the product, and hearing that firsthand is always best. But I also get very nervous because I know they're not going to talk to nearly as many customers as I will, because it's my job to do that. They should be spending most of their time coding. If they're spending, 20 hours a week on customer calls, something's seriously wrong.
Yeah.
So I know I'm going to have a broader perspective than they do. And it is a challenge to make sure that you're communicating that broader view to them. And they're not just saying, well, I heard this from I talked to one customer and I heard this, so I'm going to go build it that way. But it's still important. Better that they talk to one customer than zero, though. I agree with you on that. It's just, you have to figure out how to make sure they understand that was a sample size of one. It's
well, do you have yeah, totally. Let me give my last one, and then we'll get one more from you, and then we'll wrap it up. This has been a fun conversation, Bob. I really appreciate you sharing these pearls. So I'll give one around hiring. So for PM hiring managers, I'm a big believer in you've got to be a hell yes or no. That it is natural to meet people and want to see the best in them, and kind of, overlook this or that, and you get to a place where you can build out a team and they're fine, but like they're not the kind of over or kind of punching above their weight class team that you were hoping to build.
Mhm.
And it can be because you're like, well, the consensus is that on the panel was that people were generally leaning higher or mostly hires. But if you yourself are not a strong hire, um, you there are times where that still makes sense, but generally, I'm a big believer in having deep conviction on making a hire. I'll of course take other people's input into consideration, and if a lot of people have objections, then you have to think twice. But if you're kind of on the fence, but everybody else is generally warm, that's a dangerous hire to make. So that would be my last piece of advice I'd give myself.
Yeah, and I would agree with that 100%. If you're not, either you need to be like really, hey, this is a must hire. I'm really enthused about the person, or your panel of people you had interview need to be like all really positive. If everybody's
Mhm.
sort of like, yeah, they're fine, they're okay, you're not going to be happy with that person. And then that kind of goes to my last bit of advice, which is, yeah, as you, if I could go back and tell myself as I started becoming a senior enough PM to be hiring people under me,
Mhm.
um, the other thing I bring to it is just, I really look for somebody who is as smart as possible and hopefully smarter than I am, because I can teach them about my product. I can teach them about the product area. I can teach them about being a PM, but I can't teach somebody to be sharp. And if they're
Mhm.
not, and what I really mean by that, I guess, is that they aren't just technically strong but can't communicate, or they're not just, certainly not just a salesperson. But being a PM is tough because you need to have the ability to be technical and talk with engineering and understand when engineering is telling you something is hard and why,
Mhm.
but also engineering has to respect what you're telling them, and so they have to feel like you actually have some level of technical chops that you're worth listening to.
Mhm.
But at the same time, you also have to be articulate and able to communicate. And you have to be able, I want to be able to put you in front of a customer. I want you to be really good at demoing the product. I want you to be really good if you're working a trade show booth. God forbid that I ever have to do that again, but I'm sure I will. I want to know that you can present really well on your product also. And it's hard to find people with both those skill sets, but I think it's really important to be a good PM.
Yeah, totally agree. Yeah, there are certain things that you just you can't coach. And being able to figure out like, okay, well, how do I evaluate sharpness? uh and it's not always like, oh, can I give them the hardest brain teaser, because
Yeah.
those are proven to be not like the best predictors. And I think the other thing is that you can't teach is or is harder to teach is like chemistry and collaboration, and how is it that I and this interviewee, can we work together, you
Yeah.
know
And can
Y-
they work with engineering? Because
yeah.
that's the other thing one of us should have mentioned. I know I forgot it until just now, but as a PM, you have to be able to get engineering to do what you're telling them to do,
Mhm.
even though they don't work for you.
Yes.
So you have to be able to lead by persuasion and example, not by just telling them to do it. And I have had a couple of PM hires over my career that didn't work out, and one of them in particular kind of flamed out because he couldn't wrap his head around that. He was like, "Well, I
Mm.
told them to do it this way, and they're not listening to me." And it's like, well, no, then it's your job to persuade them. You can't just tell them. They're not. They don't report to you. We only share a reporting structure like 3 levels above me.
Yeah, 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 totally, totally.
Yeah. So you got to be
Bob,
personal.
Bob, it has been a pleasure. Anything you want to share about Mixed Mode? Are you guys looking for PM talent, or looking for engineering talent? Anything you want to share about the company?
Yeah, I mean, we're growing. We're a venture funded startup. We're based out of Santa Barbara, but we're all remote. Like I'm in the Bay Area. A bunch of our execs are kind of scattered around, but it's a good excuse to go to Santa Barbara regularly. Which, for those who haven't
Could be
been,
worse.
it's a beautiful place to go for work. It beats the heck out of having to go to, say, Dallas or Kansas City or something regularly to a corporate office. Santa Barbara is a nice place to go. Yeah, I'm hiring one PM right now. I'm looking for somebody ideally with a sort of SIEM security background, but we'll see who I can find. And then we are hiring a few engineers, I think mostly on the AI side at this point right now as well. So we're definitely growing. Check out our website if anybody's interested. It's just MixMode.ai.
All right. Well, Bob Pratt, SVP of Product from MixMode, thank you so much for coming to the Fireside PM podcast. I hope we can have you back on again. The time flew by.
Yeah, it's been great chatting with you. Have a good afternoon.
Take care, Bob. Bye. All right. Good stuff, man. I like that, Bob. Thanks to John Keister for recommending that he come on to my show. If you have other amazing product leaders that you'd like me to interview, let me know in the comments below. And let's see, let me reflect on some key takeaways or expand on any of the points before we wrap up. I would say the point for me that, like, if I only could give one piece of advice to myself, I think I would say really, really, really spend a lot of time going deep on the customer problem. And you should be able to summarize it really, really succinctly. That's how you'll know if you've done it well. I'll give you an example. When I was at YouTube, I remember Susan, our CEO, she was like, look, creators have two primary motivations. They want to be famous and they want to make money. Of course, they want to be a storyteller and they have their art and their craft. Yes, true. And they love their audience. But if you had to pick two things, that's what it comes down to. And I remember when she said that, I was like, oh, but there's like all these other motivations. There's these other kinds of creators. And it's true. But, if you know what the laws of gravity are for your customer, and they're often very simple, and you can tie that to your product, your chances of success will be much greater. Like for people selling B2B stuff or enterprise stuff, like we all know companies want to increase their revenue or cut their costs. Like that's what they want to do. And if your product doesn't have a solid line to increasing revenue or cutting costs, then it can be okay, but you have a much more difficult road to hoe. So let me know in the comments. Are there other pieces of advice that you would have given yourself earlier in your product career? And maybe we can all share. All right. See you guys later, and let's get back to work.